What is up, guys? Let's talk more about HTTP, but more specifically, let's talk about the evolution of HTTP. Like, how did it start and where are we today? Let's get into it. So, let's learn about different versions of HTTP, their features and shortcomings. This protocol was proposed and developed by Tim Berners-Lee in 1991, and this protocol has undergone many modifications that have made it feature-rich, flexible, and simple. We'll compare different HTTP versions that enable us to choose a specific version for designing an API. So here you can see all the different HTTP versions, right? And the year it was released. So we have our first one. Our second one was 5 years later. Then the next one was only a year later, and then there's a big gap between 1.1 and 2.0, and then like 4 years between 2.0 and 3.0. So we'll talk about all these versions, what's different about them, and should be interesting. So HTTP 0.9. So this was the initial version of HTTP. It was the simplest client server and request response protocol. This version only had the support of GET, like the GET request method. So we have post, put, delete, trace, options, so many more methods, but we only had GET back then, and the response would only consist of hypertext, right? There wasn't really much else. And this version had no support for HTTP headers, and as a result, this version couldn't transfer other content type files, right? So we only had one standard, content file or content type for our response. And the connection would also terminate immediately after sending the response, which is actually pretty bad, right? So then came along HTTP 1.0. So 1.0 was a browser-friendly protocol. It supported HTTP headers, fields. It supported HTTP header fields, including rich metadata for requests and responses. The response was not limited to just hypertext, but it could also transfer other types of files, such as scripts, style sheets, and media. 1.0 had the support of three HTTP methods, such as head, get, and post, and they added headers, response status codes, errors, redirection, conditional requests, and encoding. So, a lot of concepts that we are familiar with today. And so let's talk about the drawbacks of 1.0. There were some notable flaws that had to be addressed. It was still non-persistent, so it doesn't keep the connection open between requests, right? So the TCP connection would terminate after the client received the response to a single HTTP request. So this approach is called non-persistent HTTP, and it worked well when a web page was just an HTML text file, right? Now embedded links for resources like icons and other media content have increased. Really, you just have to go into your dev tools or you go to Chrome, right click, inspect, and look at the networking to see how many different things are being downloaded, like scripts and HTML files, CSS files, all types of stuff. So having like a persistent connection is definitely important nowadays. And so this non-persistence adds latency for the client. And the following illustration shows how the TCP three-way handshake is required, or the required handshake before the HTTP request is made. So if a connection establishes and terminates after a request, the three-way handshake has to be repeated before the next request. So as you can see, here we set up our connection, three-way handshake. We do a single request, we close our connection, and then we got to do another three-way handshake. So, the latency definitely adds up. So, using the internet was very slow back in the day. Another notable flaw was the lack of host header. So 1.0 had no mandatory host header in the request message. The host header identifies the target domain name to whom the request is made. If more than one website is hosted on the same server, called virtual hosting, then this header enables the server to identify the website easily. And there were limited caching headers. So there's 1.0, or in 1.0, performs cache revalidation using the if modified since header. And so then 1.0 came around, and it came with a tremendous amount of features and options that overcame the drawbacks of the previous version, such as persistent connections, right? So 1.0 enabled persistent connection. Another name for this strategy is connection reuse. So you can send more requests and get more responses, right? So see here we have our three-way handshake, which occurs before this, right? And then we can just do a request, response, request, response, request, response, right? And, this time would have been way longer if we were using 1.0 or 0.9, right? And then we close our connection. So definitely an improvement. And it also has pipelining, which it's possible to pipeline requests, which enable us to send multiple in-flight requests before the arrival of the response to the earlier requests. So this decreases the client's perceived latency and increases the system's performance, right? So if you can see in this picture, here we're like before pipelining, right, we'd have to send a request and then get a response, right? And then send a request, get a response, request, response. But now we can just send like a bunch of requests and then just get a bunch of responses back, right? So this definitely saves time on the user side. And so there were more HTTP methods, right, in 1.1. Right? Okay. And the most commonly used version, 1.1 is the most commonly used version that supports multiple HTTP methods, including head, get, post, put, delete, trace, and options. Very, very well-known methods today. And they also added in 1.1 the host header. So they made the host header mandatory, which included by default in the request. And you also have virtual hosting in 1.1, which enables a web server to host multiple websites using a single web server. So this wasn't available in 1.0 because the marketplace would be a lot simpler back then with static web pages, and now provided in 1.1 via the host HTTP header. This allows the server to determine the website a request is intended for, and it enables web hosting companies to offer services at a lower cost by hosting multiple websites on a single server. And they also add the upgrade header. So 1.1 has the ability to upgrade the already established client-server connection to a new protocol via the upgrade header. So the protocol can be upgraded to 2.0 or HTTPS after making a connection with the server. And they also added transfer encoding. So in 1.1, they provide a way to send specific commands to any proxies between the client and the server via a mechanism called transfer encoding. And they also added additional cache headers. So it has advanced headers to control cache revalidation. So let's talk about 2.0. So the starting point of 2.0 was a technology called SPDY that Google had developed before. SPDY has some essential capabilities, including multiplexing, framing, and header compression. The primary focus of 2.0 was to maintain backwards compatibility, right? They didn't want to change too much because I guess 1.1 was already working so well, and therefore the headers, URLs, and general semantics didn't really change that much. And the main features of 2.0 are the following. Prioritized responses. In the older 1.1, Multiple requests over a TCP connection are sent in a pipeline, right? We talked about pipelines, where the responses from the server are received in the order the requests were sent, right? But in 2.0, many requests can be sent and the server responds in any order just based on the priorities of the request. This feature of 2.0 is called multiplexing, in which the responses can arrive in any order. And they also added server pushed. So in 2.0, a server can send resources to a client that might be needed on the client side prior to the client's request for the resources. So this is a server push. And for example, if a client requests a web page and the server knows that it needs other resources such as style sheets and script files, the server sends these resources prior to the request from the client. So, one of the advantages of 2.0 is that it can send responses out of order. So, how can we determine which response corresponds to which request, right? And this is actually pretty simple. In 2.0, each request is marked with a unique identifier before sending it to the server, and the responses coming back from the server will include that identifier from the request that they belong to, and a browser can quickly determine which response corresponds with which request, right? And what is the difference between pipelining and multiplexing, as we talked about? So there's a subtle difference between pipelining and multiplexing, and that is the order of arrival of the responses. So in pipelining, if you send multiple HTTP requests over a single TCP connection, then so basically the responses return in the order you sent the requests, right? But in multiplexing, we can make multiple requests over the same TCP connection without having to wait for the earlier requests' responses, so they can arrive in any order. So it's basically the difference is the order at which the responses return. So let's talk about HTTP 3.0. So the primary difference between 2.0 and 3.0 is the transport protocol that is used to support HTTP messages. So the previous version relied on TCP, Transmission Control Protocol. However, 3.0 uses quick UDP internet connections on top of User Datagram Protocol, so UDP. And the main features of 3.0 are the adoption of the quick protocol, as we said. So they have multiplexing of streams and per stream flow control that's provided by Quick, a transport protocol. It has the capacity to enhance HTTP performance in comparison to TCP mapping by offering stream level reliability and congestion control through the connection. They also added TLS 1.3. So on the transport layer, this provides similar security and integrity to running TLS over TCP and improved performance. 3.0 has lower latency and high reliability due to the adoption of the quick protocol. In some studies, 3.0 is faster than 2.0. And also, it avoids head-of-line blocking. So it also addresses a major problem in 1.1 and 2.0 known as blocking. And in this picture, you can see a few different versions. So you have 1.1, 2.0, 3.0. And as you can see, 1.1 and 2.0 use TCP, while 3.0 uses UDP. And here we have, for 1.1 it uses TLS, SSL, and then 2.0 uses TLS 1.2, and then 3.0 uses TLS 1.3 and Quick. So there are a few differences there. And here we have a comparison of the different versions of HTTP, right? So if you go through from earliest to latest versions, so here we only have GET at the very beginning, and now we have all of these different methods provided. And we started seeing support for headers in 1.1, right? And we started seeing persistent TCP connections, um, or persistent connections. We don't have TCP in 3.0, but then you have some newer features that have been added over the versions. So let's summarize, right? So we discussed various versions of the HTTP protocol, including 0.9, 1.0, 1.1, 2.0, and 3.0. And we presented the pros and cons of each protocol that will help us select a specific HTTP version for a particular service. So hopefully you learned something. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe. Let me know if anything, and hopefully you learned something. And thanks for watching.